So when I first started working with behavioral science concepts over a decade ago, I never expected to be working in the surgical community on environmental sustainability in surgery. Over the last several months, I've been absolutely blown away by all of your enthusiasm for doing something that has the potential to benefit generations to come. And I'd like you to give yourselves a round of applause for showing up here today. I think you really deserve that. Well done. But of course, if you hadn't shown up here today, you would have been fined, right? You paid a deposit on your ticket, and if you hadn't come, you would have incurred a financial cost. And that's the traditional economic approach to behavior change. If you don't want someone to do something, fine them. And if you do want someone to do something, pay them. But we're not going to go around paying people to do more environmentally sustainable things. We just don't have the budget to do that, and it would interfere with their freedom. Fortunately, there are far more things that we can do in our arsenal of behavioral science approaches. But behavior change is hard, and we need to get this right. How many of you have tried to change something about your own behavior and found it difficult to do so? Just with a show of hands, whether it's eating more healthily, perhaps taking a sustainable mode of transport to work, something like that. So most people have struggled to do that. Thank you for your honesty. And that's really important, because if it's that hard to change our own behavior, imagine just how difficult it is to influence other people's behavior. Well, one of the key concepts underpinning many approaches to behavior change is something called dual systems theory, dual cognitive theory. And it goes something like this. On the one hand, we have a mental process in our brains and a way of making decisions that's very deliberative and slow, very conscious, and usually it's quite accurate. And on the other hand, we have another cognitive system, and it's very quick. It's unconscious, it's automatic, and it makes mistakes, but it helps us to address and encounter all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that we make every day. Now, this is, of course, an oversimplification. You know probably better than I do that there actually aren't two parts of the brain that work like that, but it is a helpful classification in terms of thinking about the way in which we make decisions. Now, to illustrate dual systems theory, I have a problem for you from the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman. It's a classic problem in behavioral science. If a baseball bat and a ball cost a total of £1.10, and the bat costs £1 more than the ball, then how much does the ball cost? Quick, what's the first answer that pops into your head? For most people, the first answer that pops into their head is 10p. But with a little bit of time and a little bit of conscious deliberation, most people work out that that's not the correct answer, that the correct answer is, in fact, 5p. And there are two systems at work here. One is the automatic quick system that I just talked about that has a first answer that pops into your head, and the other is the more slow and deliberative system that arrives at the answer of 5p. The reason that this happens is something called attribute substitution. It's a mental heuristic or shortcut whereby we replace something difficult, such as the bat costs £1 more than the ball, with something a little bit easier, such as the bat costs £1. What does all of this mean in terms of automatic versus other types of thinking for healthcare and for surgery? Well, as one example of the way in which automatic thinking plays out in healthcare, some of my colleagues were interested in influences on hand-washing behavior. And they took a group of medical students and recent interns, 165 of them, and asked them to examine a patient complaining of heart palpitations. And they randomly divided them into two different groups. In one group, they pumped the smell of citrus into the air before they examined the patient complaining of the heart palpitations. And in the other group, there was no smell of citrus in the air. There was no air freshener. And the results showed that quite automatically, when those students and interns smelled that citrus, they were far more likely to engage in hand-washing behavior before they examined that patient. It's not because they didn't know that hand-washing was important. It's because they automatically reacted to the cues in their environment. And much of behavior change is about things that happen because they're not so much thought about, they simply come about as a result of context and changes and cues in our environment. Automatic motivation is part of something called the behavior change wheel. The behavior change wheel was developed by Professor Susan Mickey and colleagues in 2011. It was based on a systematic review of all approaches to behavior change at the time, and it included expert consensus. Automatic motivation is one part of the complex puzzle of behavior change. The ones shown on your screen are the other bits of the puzzle. When Professor Mickey talks about the behavior change wheel, she often talks about it in terms of solving a crime. So what would you need to do to understand, as perhaps a lawyer, whether or not someone committed a crime? Did they have the capability to do so, both psychologically? Did they know how to perform that behavior to enact that crime? Did they have the knowledge and skills? Did they have the physical capability to do so? Could they actually carry that out? Could they perform the behavior, the crime, in that way? Did they have the opportunity to do so, both socially? Were there other people around? Was it a social norm? Did they have the physical opportunity to do so? What was it about their environment that afforded that behavior, that allowed them to commit that crime or not? And then, of course, motivation, which we've already talked about, which can be quite automatic or reflective and deliberative as well. Now, James is going to be taking you through the behavior change wheel in more detail, but these are the key sources of behavior and the key barriers and facilitators of all different types of behavior, whether sustainability, healthcare, or otherwise. And I like the wheel because it doesn't assume that the reason people don't do things is because of a lack of knowledge. A lot of times when I'm approached by members of the surgical community or healthcare community more generally, they come to me and they say, Laura, I've got this great idea for a new training and education intervention. I want to go out and I want to give more people information, and they're going to change what they do. But oftentimes, a lack of information and a lack of knowledge is not the reason that people aren't performing the particular behavior. Remember how many of you raised your hands earlier and said that you'd had a difficult time changing your own behavior. It's not because you didn't know what to do. There were other things going on as well. So very helpfully, this behavior change wheel maps onto different intervention functions that James is going to talk about as well, that can be used in order to change behavior, and different sources of policy categories that can also be used to influence and change behavior. We're going to do that mapping in a second in the next section, but just to be aware of at the minute that there are many different behavioral levers that can be pulled. Now let's say you've done it right. You've used the behavior change wheel, you've developed an excellent and exciting intervention, you have conducted a multi-center cluster randomized controlled trial, it's effective, it works. Do you think that people are going to be using your intervention? I can see some of you shaking your head no. Correct. Even if it works, it's very unlikely to actually be taken up into practice. And some widely cited studies that have been around for several decades suggest that it takes almost 20 years for an intervention to become accepted in practice, even after there's evidence of its efficacy. It's a long time. Together with colleagues here at the University of Birmingham, we re-examined this evidence intervention gap in surgery. And we took 6 key surgical trials that had clear implications for practice and looked at whether or not they actually changed practice. We found, quite encouragingly, in half of the studies, practice did change in the direction expected. In one case, it took about 10 years, not 20, thank goodness. In another one, it largely tracked the evolving evidence base. In another one, it actually predated the trial. But for the other half, there was always a good reason why the evidence wasn't taken up into practice. And usually that had to do with the fact that there was other competing sources of evidence that the intervention deliverers found more persuasive. And innovation in terms of evidence is not something that maps well onto the behavior change wheel. It's something that is part of a broader field called implementation science, which Yestin touched on earlier, and which is about the way in which an innovation or an intervention can be taken up into practice. Part of it is about individuals, yes, but it's also about the wider systems and contexts. So things like the innovation, its source and its evidence, things like the inner and outer settings, a particular hospital or also healthcare system, thinking about individuals but also teams and the team dynamics, capability, opportunity, and motivation, yes, but even beyond that, and thinking about implementation processes as well, thinking about planning, tailoring, and adapting. So it's important to keep in mind both individual and kind of wider systems level influences on behavior change. And with that, I'm going to hand over to James to take you through the next part of your training.
Thank you very much. So, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the journey from identifying behavioural barriers in our environment through to the potential solutions, and to take you through that journey applied to the Dragon trial that you've heard about earlier. I became interested in behaviour change theory as part of my PhD when I used this model to look at the reasons why people were recruited to trials in our global surgery portfolio and why they stayed in the trials until the end. And I have to say, it's a complex world, but taking a theoretical approach, I think really helps us with strategy to make a difference in the end. And I think that's what we need today. Richard Horton, who's the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, in 1996 put to the world that surgical research is a comic opera. And Jessamy, who's one of the Lancet editors, and Dimitri and colleagues this year updated that and said, we think that due to the advent of these collaborative surgical trials, surgical research is no longer a comic opera. But I put to you today that the fact that it takes us 20 years to get from evidence to practice is a comic opera, and surgical implementation perhaps is the next big step for us to address. So I'll need you all to get Wi-Fi access if you haven't already, please. There's a guest University of Birmingham Wi-Fi that you can just sign in with your name, your surname, and your email. So I'm going to take you to, let's say, 3 years in the future. It's going to be very generous. And we've just recruited as a network 28,000 patients to the Dragon trial. Congratulations. It's been published in The Lancet. Well, yeah, fantastic. Well done. It's been published in The Lancet, and there's this landmark trial that shows that reusable gowns and drapes are safe. They don't increase wound infection. They are cost-effective and reduce costs to the NHS. And there is actually a carbon benefit to using reusable rather than disposable gowns and drapes. So, thinking about this behaviour of introducing reusable gowns and drapes to your operating theatre, rather than using a disposable alternative, we're going to have a little think about what you perceive would be the barriers to making that change. So you can scan the QR code, or you can go to this website, menti.com, and enter this code. So for the AV team, if we could go to the live vote system, that would be wonderful. So I can see some votes floating in already. Apparently, if there's 500 people voting, it starts to get a bit slow. Hopefully, there's not that many people in the audience. So there's an introductory question. We've got your professional background. I should say sustainability role, sorry. We debated for about 15 minutes about which the categories we'd put up there, so forgive me if you're not properly represented. So it looks like we have a really nice, diverse room. Less than half of the room is from surgery. We've got to have anaesthetists, sustainability roles, industry partners, academics. There's people, the votes are still floating in. So we've got a really nice, diverse audience. Wonderful. So I'm going to pause that for a second. We're going to go to how the combi wheel might look for us. So if we were thinking about introducing these reusable gowns and drapes in our operating theatre, this is how this theory may be applied to that question. So if we were talking about physical capability, that would be about being able to size and put on the reusable gown and undo the buttons at the end of the case, which seems to annoy lots of people, and then to be able to then put them in the correct recycling bin. So that's a physical capability problem. If this was a psychological capability problem, that would be about knowing how to use and reuse them. The opportunity physical would be actually having the gowns in theatre with you. So when you go to the shelf, it's not just disposable gowns, it's the reusable gowns. The social opportunity would perhaps be this being seen as a norm, or by other theatres and other colleagues using the reusable gowns and gloves. The automatic motivation is this unconscious motivation, so it's our base human instincts. Perhaps fear that using reusable gowns and gloves might increase infection, for example. And then your reflective motivation would be something about which requires some processing, so it's a cognitive thought about you've evaluated the Dragon trial and you do or don't believe the results. So these are the examples of combi in practice for the Dragon trial. And I'd like you to vote, if you go to the next slide, please, on which you think would be most important or the most relevant barrier in your operating theatre. What would stop you from doing this? So, interesting, a lot of thoughts around opportunity, which hopefully, I have to say, probably you would hope might be a relatively easy one to fix, perhaps. But perhaps yes, then, and we'd think differently, perhaps not. So fascinating. So really, most of the themes popping up are around opportunity. People seem happy that they would be able to put the gowns on and remove them. And perhaps this unconscious motivation. So that's something that we're directly addressing, perhaps, in the Dragon trial. 170 votes. We'll hopefully take a screenshot of that and use that on Twitter later. And so as the next step, I'd like to hand over to Virginia, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about what the network around the world thought on this topic, and then we'll tie it all together at the end to some solutions. Thank you, Virginia.